Morning, and thank you for joining the Extended Day Ahead Market Working Group 2 meeting related to the transmission commitment and congestion rent allocation. My name is Elisandra Casillas from the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group, and I'll be providing support for the meeting. Deb Levine is a facilitator assigned to this working group, and Emily Hughes is the scribe, along with Phil Pettingill, who is listed as a panelist, is the coordinator overseeing all three of the active EDAM working groups. The meetings for this working group will return to its regular cadence, which are held weekly on Tuesday and Thursdays from 9 to 11 a.m. Participation details for each of the meetings is available on the ISO's public calendar. Next, please. Next slide, please.
Just 1 minute, please.
Thank you.
I apologize. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Some meeting reminders. These working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we encourage participants to share ideas and perspectives during these meetings. If at any time you have a question, please raise your hand and the facilitator will call on you. And as a reminder, please state your name and affiliation first so that the rest of the group knows who's speaking. The working group meetings are recorded and video files are posted on corresponding working group web pages. Please request permission from the ISO before reprinting these transcriptions. Stakeholders are welcome to present perspectives at these meetings. Please submit a request to present using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of this presentation. The materials related to the Working Group 2 meetings are posted on the associated webpage, which is also linked on the resources slide, along with other links to help you engage in the EDAM stakeholder process. Next slide, please. For today's agenda, after my welcome and introduction, I will turn the meeting over to Deb Levine to discuss today's objectives. Then we will proceed with James Lynn, who will discuss transmission revenue distribution, followed by Deb to open the discussion on Bucket 2 compensation, then close with upcoming topics. And with that, I will turn it over to Deb Levine.
Thanks so much, Ellie. Next slide, please. So today, as we discussed last week, we're going to continue the discussion of the transfer revenue examples that James has put out in the Excel spreadsheet that is posted on the CAISA website for Working Group 2. Then I wanted to make sure we have a discussion regarding the congestion rent compensation for Bucket 2, including OAT and non-OAT rights, and review the various scenarios. And if we get an opportunity at the end, we are prepared with the examples to show how the megawatts flow across the different EDAM, non-EDAM BAAs, and how all that would work. But I imagine between the first two bullet items, we'll be pretty full today. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll turn it over to James. Operator, could you please give share rights to James for his?
Yes, I just gave the presenting rights to James.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everybody. This is James Lynn. I'm the Senior Advisor for the California ISO. I'm going to do a quick review of what we discussed last week, and then we'll move on to the other examples. And afterwards, we'll have some internal discussions on what the examples are showing and how we came to some of the conclusions of the sharing of the revenues. In example 1, we established a situation where it's called a transfer to location. This is typically between two EIM or EDAM BAAs. These BAAs are both providing transmission in order to facilitate the transfer of energy between the two BAAs. Generally, this transfer revenue would end up with a 50-50 split between the two BAAs because they're both providing the same amount of transmission, and it's at a midway point between the two BAAs. And then that transfer revenue is then allocated to the appropriate transmission customer or LSC. In example 2, we started to talk about a situation that's more along the line with the ISO, which is called transfer through locations. And this is where an EDAM BAA is providing the transmission to get to the boundary of the ISO footprint. And in this discussion, we talked about the options on whether or not the revenue should be shared, as well as the intertie transmission constraint should be shared among all the parties, whether or not it's just the ETSR or transfer revenue that should be shared, and the ITC should remain within the balancing authority area where the ITC was modeled, or if we should do it where the transfer revenue should go to the EDAM BAA, which is providing the transmission to get the energy to that boundary, and then the ITC remains within the balancing authority area of, in this case, would be BAB. Now, we made it through this at a little bit of a rush, and I know there was some questions. We tried to answer them real quickly at the end of the last call, but we don't need to start there. When we do example 3, I'm sure that some of these same questions will be raised again. But what we wanted to say is that now in these discussions, these same type of spreadsheets were presented to the California ISO entities as well as the EDAM entities, a subset, and when they were developing the key principles. One of the key principles that we came up when walking through these examples was that the most applicable way of assigning these costs or allocating these transfer revenue and ITC would be that transfer revenue should be going to the BAA, which is providing that transmission to get to the boundary. And then once it reaches the boundary of the ISO internal transmission takes over, and therefore the ITC should be remain allocated to the internal CRRs within the ISO balancing authority area. Excuse me for a second. I had to clear my throat. So giving those as a starting point, what we're going to do is walk through is how we got to this original starting point as the principle of how these transfer revenues should be potentially allocated. This isn't the proposal. This is just the starting point of the discussion, but I want to get us to that location. Now, so example 3, what we have introduced in example 2, I just had 2 EDAM BAAs transferring energy to the ISO balancing authority area. Now we're introducing a non-EDAM BAA. And now all these transfers are located at the same transfer point or same intertie point. So they're competing to get the energy into the balancing authority area B. And in this example, where I've changed the limits a little bit so that I can maintain that the import capability into balancing authority area B is 700 megawatts. So EDAM BAA is going to have a transfer limit of 200 megawatts that is actually being provided by transmission customer 2 in this scenario. And then for EDAM BAC, they're providing an additional transfer capability into the ISO of 100 megawatts. So what we've done is establish specific ETSRs for each of those transfer locations. So ETSR 1 represents the 200 megawatts capability to get energy from BAA to BAB. Transfer 2, ETSR 2 is the capability to get energy from BAC to BAB. And then we've introduced the non-EDAM BAA, which is going to be submitting self-schedules and bids at the intertie location in order to provide energy into the BAB or in this case, the ISO. So what I'm going to do is jump pretty much directly into the examples of the scenarios on how to share the revenues associated with it, as well as congestion associated with the intertie ITC. So in this scenario, obviously we have 700 megawatts that's being imported into the ISO. That 700 megawatts have 200 coming from BAA, so that balancing authority area is binding. We also have 100 megawatts coming from BAC, so that BA is also binding. And then I have 400 megawatts coming in from a non-EDAM BAA. So what we are at is that not only is the ETSRs binding, but because we have additional energy being scheduled from a non-EDAM BAA, the ITC is now binding as well. So if we were to share the ITC and the ETSR revenue, what it would result in is the transfer revenue would be the difference between $29 and the $25 associated for balancing authority areas BAA and BAC, because the clearing price at that intertie would be associated with $29, which is the non-EDAM BA bid price, and so our cleared price. So the transfer revenue would be $1,200. Well, this $1,200 is to be shared between BAA, BAB, and BAC under scenario 2A. So I have $600 going into BAB, $400 going into BAA, and $200 going to BAC. What this represents is the transfer of the 50% of the transfer revenue from BAA to BAB, which was $400 or for $800, which is being distributed 400 to BAA, 400 BAB, plus then you have the $200 of transfer revenue, or $400 of transfer revenue, which is being split between BAC and BAB. That's how we come up with the total numbers and that distribution. Now, if we're going to share the ITC shadow price, we come up with is going to have to be shared between BAA, BAB, and BAC, depending upon the transfer capability and the binding constraints. And so what we've determined using this sharing is that $1,300 will be made in BAA. Oh, wait, we have a mistake here. I need to correct something. Oh, hold on. That's why. I'm going to change the example back. There we go. I have $200 going into BAA. I have $100 going into BAC, and then $1,100 remaining in BAAB. So this shows that there's a split, and that is going to be based upon the energy that is being provided to BAB associated with that balancing authority area. So again, it's 200 megawatts from BAA times half of the ITC price for, that's how we get $200 in BAA. Same for BAC. BAB gets the $300 that was split between the EDAM BAs and BAB. And then, but it also will receive the full ITC costs associated with a non-EDAM BA. So now I'm going to switch over to scenario 2B, where the ETSRs are shared, but the ITC is not. Now, only thing that is basically changing between 2A and 2B is instead of splitting the cost of the ITT shadow price between the three BAAs based upon the transfer capability or transfer usage. What we have made the determination was in this scenario is that once it gets to the boundary, we're using internal transmission to BAB, all of those costs will be associated with BAB for distribution through in our case, for the ISO, through the CRRs. And then scenario 2C, what we've done is taken a little different look and said that because the EDAM BAs are providing all the transmission to the boundary of BAB, that the balancing authority area that's providing the transmission should receive all the transfer revenue for facilitating that transfer of energy from their balancing authority area into BAB. And then once it gets into BAB, the ITC or internal transmission takes over, and then the ITC should be allocated to the specific CRRs associated with BAB. So how that results is BAA gets $800 from the transfer revenue. BAC gets $400 from the transfer revenue. BAB would receive no transfer revenue. However, they would be compensated by the fact that internal transmission was binding, and so therefore BAA would get $0 associated with that. BAB would get all $1,400 associated with the ITC binding. And then BAC would also get a $0 because we have made that distinction that it should be separated between external versus internal binding constraints. And I'll open it up for any questions. I know I'm going a little fast, but we've looked at these at least once other time. I'm just introducing a new balancing authority area.
Yeah, no problem, James. Doug Boccignoni, you have a question?
So let me unmute their line. You'll hear a beep tone once your line is unmuted. After that, please proceed with your question. Your line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thank you. This is Doug Boccignoni for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. So it looks like the assumption is that the ITC is connecting AC and the non-EDAM BA to BAB. Is that correct?
Yes. So what's happening is that the intertie at the footprint of BAB is where all the transfers are occurring. So I have some competing going on at that location. And the ITC is associated with the fact that that intertie, once it has gone beyond the transfer location, is within that balancing authority area, and there is binding. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I'm sorry, but I couldn't hear you. So I'm sorry, James. I did not hear what you said.
Okay, I think your question, let me repeat what I think your question was that the transfer from BAA, BAC, and the EDAM, the ITC is at the injection point of the boundary, and that's facilitating the flow of energy into BAB. Is that roughly what your question was?
Well, and yeah, is that ITC connecting all three of the BAA, C, and the non-EDAM BAA to BAB?
Yeah. So what's going to happen is we'll establish at the boundary of BAB, there'll be an intertie hand location, and that would be, in this case for the ISO, that would be a part of our footprint. At that intertie, we will have internal to the ISO ITC constraint when that is binding to reflect the flow of that energy to all the load within that balancing authority area. So if it is a binding, then we are now having to go get energy from other places in order to fulfill the need within BAB. Now, so the 700 megawatts is basically the ISO has turned over all of its transmission at that location, saying, okay, if you bring in, let's say BAA brings in 200 megawatts to that intertie, then it will be able to, if economic, will be able to send energy to the ISO, and then once it hits the ISO, our internal transmission takes over, which is the ITC. So it is associated to all three, but it is like a max limit that I can pull from all three. So if each one of these BAAs had 700 megawatts capability, all three are going to be compete to get the energy into the ISO.
So the intertie bids and the EDAM transfers are competing to cross the same constraint.
Correct.
And these examples are assuming that the value of that hitting that limit, the intertie limit, in this case is dictated by the $2 differential between the non-EDAM BAA and BAB.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we have any? Yeah, Jeff Spires, go ahead.
Yes, let me unmute your line. Please go ahead.
Good morning, James. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX.
Good morning, Jeff.
Thanks again. Good morning. Thanks again for putting together the examples. They certainly help to understand different outcomes based on different assumptions. The one thing that you mentioned that I think is worth re-emphasizing, and I would almost think that in a future version of this spreadsheet, it might be worth considering an update to, is with respect to the non-EDAM transfer and the congestion that occurs as a result of that. In all of these scenarios, I don't think that we are talking about whether or not we would allocate that congestion between EDAM entities and the CAISO. I think the underlying assumption is that if you have, in this example, 400 megawatts of non-EDAM transfers, and there is $2 of congestion in the CAISO BA, those dollars would remain with the CAISO. And I agree with that assumption. I think it's worth potentially taking those dollars and putting them on their own row in the spreadsheet just to help clarify that we're not talking about whether or not to share non-EDAM congestion related values, first of all, but also because just looking at the results towards the bottom here of the ultimate dollars that end up in the different BAs, it's not as clear to me, what to conclude necessarily when some of those dollars are associated with non-EDAM transfers. So, in this example, you might take $2 times that 400 megawatts of flow and just lay it out as being kind of separate from EDAM altogether. So that then I think what that would do is make it more clear that what we're really talking about, if I look at scenario 2A, is we're taking the $6 of total congestion between the EDAM entities and the CAISO and allocating that back out equally between CAISO and the two EDAM BAs. So you have $1,800 of congestion, $900 goes to the CAISO, $900 goes back to the EDAM BAs pro rata, as opposed to 2C, where you are basically calculating which side fills first and to what extent, and then not sharing those. So that's just one piece of feedback around trying to clarify what the results are here. The second thing I just wanted to say with this is these are very helpful examples. I do think that we should go back to a discussion about the objective when we're looking at these examples and what do we think collectively that we're trying to achieve. You articulated that under example 1, where there are just 2 EDAM BAs, and you pointed out that when there are 2 EDAM BAs, the basic assumption is that the congestion between those 2 entities is allocated back 50-50, recognizing that there are transmission rights holders on both sides. And I think a similar discussion should be occurring here. We have these interties between EDAM BAs and the CAISO. There are multiple segments required to support the transactions on either side of the intertie. So you have rights holders both upstream of the CAISO getting to the intertie, as well as within the CAISO on the downstream side. And the question is, how do we determine a congestion value allocation that is fair, given that there are multiple rights holders funding the lines on either side? And I think the question I would pose is, do we think it would be the right outcome if whatever solution we end up going with were to result in a disproportionate share being allocated either to the upstream segment on the external system or to the downstream segment within the CAISO? Or do we agree that that's not what we would want to see and that we should be striving towards an equitable outcome? Because I think that should be the objective, and that we should be having some common consensus around what we are trying to achieve, including an equitable allocation of the congestion value on these transfers, and then use that common agreement to evaluate a reasonable approach to achieve that. Otherwise, I just struggle with how do we evaluate different scenarios given, without being grounded in what we're trying to accomplish. So those are my comments. Thank you.
So Jeff, I agree with you. What these examples are designed to do is facilitate the conversation. But in order to really facilitate the conversation, I've always, believed we need to have a starting point. And then, so based upon previous discussions, we think the starting point of the discussion should be 2C. Whether or not we move off of that, that is what these internal working groups are for. So I am in agreement with you is that these working group discussions should be focused on what is the most appropriate way of allocating transfer revenue and internal congestion in order to ensure that all the balancing authority areas are made whole in relationship to those transfer and the congestion within that balancing authority area. And I'm hoping the next 3 will help us move along and facilitate that discussion. Sorry, Jeff.
No, I appreciate that. I think what I'm struggling with is that I don't, in my interpretation of 2C, the outcome is that the congestion effectively gets returned to whichever side fills first, whether it's the ETSR or the CAISO ITC. And so I don't see how that calculation, which could lead to, as I mentioned before, a disproportionate share being allocated to one side or the other, as leading to an equitable outcome. So I'm not understanding what the justification is for that and why that's different than the more general principle that you were articulating between 2 EDAM BAs, where there's a recognition that you have multiple rights holders contributing transmission to support the transfer, and that the congestion value associated with those transfers should be allocated back equally. So that explanation makes sense to me, and I think it is clear, but so far I don't understand what the rationale is to start with something different that could lead to unintended consequences, because you're leaving it to the algorithm to decide which side fills first and then allocate from there.
Jeff, this is Deb. What we're trying to get to and show you various examples so that you have a picture of all the different ways that this can be calculated is what is reasonable to most parties under most scenarios. There's a lot of moving parts here. So, you know, overall, what we're trying to get to is what's reasonable for most parties. So we have a question from Jeffrey Nelson.
Yes. Your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. It's Jeff Nelson here, SCE. Back-to-back Jeffs. Gets confusing. Yeah, another important principle that doesn't come through in the spreadsheet is the entire way the ISO's congestion, CRR process, allocation process, congestion allocation works. And one of the principles that we think is important, and I think we sort of agreed to going into this, is we're not trying to change that process. Those processes don't exist in any other balancing authorities. So there is some flexibility to do things differently for the other balancing authorities. We're not trying to rewrite the way we do congestion allocation, CRRs within the ISO as part of the EDAM process, or at least that's one of my objectives. And also the fact that you've got sort of two ways of getting this ITC filled, both by EDAM participants and non-EDAM participants. You know, this is going to create some interesting decisions that people that have flexibility are going to make on whether they go through an EDAM or they go through the non-EDAM. And it's my view that we need to preserve this ITC allocation all back to ISO to sort of immunize the ISO of the decisions people make that have optionality on how they're going to come in. So I feel very strongly that this is important to keep the congestion going back from congestion that's generated within the ISO back to ISO participants. Thanks.
And Kathy Anderson, did you have a comment on that?
Let me unmute your line. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I didn't have any comment on that. Sorry.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. James, why don't you keep going?
Okay. So the next three examples are basically built off of this example. It is to show how they're going to show how these allocations would occur if only specific scenarios resulted. And again, these three examples are designed to facilitate the discussion, particularly ones that Jeff Spires and Jeff Nelson have been addressing. And Jeff, I do point out in here a little bit of what happens to CRRs. So hopefully this will help facilitate the discussions. So in the first discussion, or the first example, I'm only having the ETSRs binding. My flow is less than the ITC limit within the ISO, but all the two ETSRs are at their limits. And then, so how would we, given the three methodology of doing distribution, how would that result in this settling out? Now, for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. In scenario 2A and 2B, we are sharing the transfer revenue for the binding between BAA and BAB, as well as BAC and BAB. This transfer revenue is $1,200, and it's split based upon the transmission used. So I would have $400 going to BAA, $600 going into the ISO, which is BAB, and $200 for BAC. And then once we get to the point where we looked at not sharing the ETSRs, then the BAA would receive the full $800 associated with the binding of the ETSR between BAA and BAB. And then BAC would receive the full transfer revenue associated between the binding constraint between BAC and BAB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through all three because the last one is a combining of the ETSR binding and the ITC binding. At that point, we can go on and facilitate more questions. So in this case, there is no CRR shortfall. Now, once I get into example 5, where I have only the ITC binding, this is where we start drawing on what would the impact be for CRRs. So my flow of energy from BAA to BAB is not at its limit. It's 150 megawatts and not at 200 megawatts. BAC is at 50 megawatts, not at its limit of 100 megawatts. But the rest of the energy, which is going to be 500 megawatts, is coming from a non-EDAM BAA, which has pushed the ITC to its limits within BAB, and therefore I have ITC shadow price of $2. Now, in this case, for scenario 2A, where we're sharing this ITC constraint, it's going to be $150 goes to BAA, $1,200 to BAB, $50 to BAC. What this results in is also that we have shortfall occurring within the BAB because we shared the congestion associated with that ITC with BAA and BAC. So then the CRRs associated with that intertie or transfer location are going to be shorted $200 payback of congestion rents. BAB or 2B, we're not sharing it, and so then 2B and 2C are exactly the same. Since the ITC is only remaining in BAB, all $1,400 remains in BAB and then distributed within BAB, and there is no shortfall on CRRs. And so I want to be clear on that when I'm saying shortfall is I'm assuming that the CRRs were equivalent to $2. So just make a real quick assumption there in order to determine shortfall. In example 6, I've combined it. Both the ETSRs are binding and the ITC limit is binding. So this goes similar to example 3. We are just now demonstrating the fact that under this scenario, then the CRRs are being shorted $300 under scenario 2A because that $300 from the ITC is being shared with BAA and BAC and not being used to fulfill CRRs. And then 2B and 2C, we start getting into how we would handle it if we didn't share the ITC and only shared the ETSRs for 2B, and then back to we don't share the ETSR and we don't share the ITC. So this is scenario 3. I just broke it down a little bit further to facilitate some discussions because I wanted to show the impact on CRRs when we're looking at sharing ITC. Any questions?
I do see a couple of callers in the queue. Moving on to the first caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, James. It's Jeff Spires again with PowerX. Just looking at example 6 here, I think that the conclusion that there's a CRR shortfall in scenario 2A is, I assume, and maybe you can help me understand this better, but it seems like what you're assuming is that the CRR payoff is based on the ITC only, but you're not incorporating the fact that in scenario 2A, the CAISO is also receiving half of the transfer revenue. So there's actually another $600 of transfer revenue that would be getting shared with the CAISO that presumably would then go to fund the CRRs. So it seems like you're only looking at the fact that, yes, you're under 2A, 50% of the ITC is being shared and going to the EDAM entities, but there's also revenues that in this example are actually greater than that, which is you've got a $600 of additional revenue on a new revenue stream from the transfer revenue coming in that you haven't allocated back to the CRR rights holders. And it seems to me that, you know, under scenario 2A, what would be a more realistic assumption is that the CRR rights holders on the CAISO side of the intertie would be entitled to not only the 50% of the ITC, but also the 50% of the transfer revenue. So it seems that they would be better off.
So, Jeff, I'm actually really glad you pointed that out. And if you remember, one of the principles associated with the allocation of the transfer revenue is that it goes back to the transmission customer that is providing the transmission to facilitate the transfer. So under this scenario, I don't have 100% assurance that the CRR holder at this location is also the transmission owner who is providing the transmission within the ISO. So
but you agree that there's
revenue.
You agree that there's $600 that's not incorporated, right? Into the example.
Yes, can you go ahead and finish before you cut him off?
Yeah. So I'm agreeing there's $600. That $600, what we did with this example is we allocated directly to the transmission owners who have provided that transmission, which is not necessarily the CRR holders. I am agreeing that there is $600 coming from transfer revenue into BAB, but it is not necessarily going to be used to fund CRRs, is what I was trying to demonstrate here, because I was trying to ensure that I follow the principles of transfer revenue being allocated to transmission customers.
I think that the outcome of the way that you've portrayed this, if you just read this spreadsheet, is that there's a risk of misinterpretation that there is a aggregate dollar shortfall available to entities within the CAISO BA, either through CRRs or whatever mechanism that the CAISO chooses to allocate those funds. So the point that I was trying to raise is that when we're deciding the total dollars that should be allocated between different BAs and then presumably sub-allocated from that point forward to potentially specific CRR holders or specific transmission customers, et cetera, if we just start with the total dollars that are going to the different BAs, there isn't a shortfall under 2A with respect to the total dollars.
I hear your point, and I believe we can have some additional discussions on this. Yes.
Okay, we have Doug Boccignoni has a question.
The line has been unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Doug Boccignoni with the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Yeah, I think Jeff Spires is raising a good point that we should think about. I'm still trying to think through what are the circumstances under which the ITC limit can bind or not bind when the ETSR limits are binding or not binding. And I think to my earlier question, James, when we were talking about, I can't remember if it was example 2 or 3, it sounded like the ITC limit is, what your earlier answer made me think it was both the ETSRs and the intertie bids were competing for the transmission capacity on the BAAB side of the constraint. But then in some of this discussion, it makes it sound like that could not be the case, if you could have a circumstances under which the ITC limit doesn't bind. So I'm just wondering if some of the it seems like the results would be different. I mean, I think your examples show that the results are different if the intertie limit binds or doesn't bind. And yet when I think about what's happening, the power that's flowing into BAB, whether you're calling it intertie scheduled flows or transferred flows, it's still the same power that's going from A, C, and the non-EDAM to BAB. So it seems like if you can get a different outcome depending on how things are bid at the ties versus transferred, it seems like you could get unintended consequences.
I'm not sure. I have an answer to that question. I was trying to demonstrate exactly what you are indicating. Yes, we can have situations where, based upon bids at the intertie location at the ISO boundary, and the ETSR transfer capability, that we may never reach the limit of the BAB's internal transmission limit, the intertie scheduling limit. In that scenario, I wouldn't have any transfer revenue. Let's say that the EDAM BAs didn't bind and my non-EDAM BA didn't fill it up. There is no transfer revenue, or potentially there won't be any transfer revenue, but there also won't be any ITC congestion to allocate out. What I was trying to demonstrate here, what happens when, based upon the market optimization, determine that the energy is more economic to come. The first one was more economic to come from the EDAM BAA versus taking an intertie bid at the same intertie location. At that point, the ETSRs are binding, but the ITC is not. So this example is trying to demonstrate what do we think is the most appropriate way to allocate those costs based upon a little bit on what the principles on providing that transmission. So in this case, since BAA is providing the transmission to the boundary of the ISO, the thought process, we could share it, or we could have BAA receive all the transfer revenue. And 2C is demonstrating the fact that since they provided all the transmission to get the energy from BAA to BAB's boundary, that they should receive all that transfer revenue. Where we get into example 5 is what happens when...
Actually, before you go on,
go ahead.
Can we go back?
Yeah.
So I guess, that was sort of illustrating the point is, I mean, the power that's flowing in is whether the ITC limit is binding or not is the same, right? In this instance, right? There's a certain quantity that's coming in, and and there's value, right? The transfer takes place because there's value. But it seems like that value's there, whether the intertie constraint binds or not. And what I was getting at before is with this, I mean, anybody can bid at the intertie under the current rules. So, it seems like if you could have a circumstance where the allocation changes based on bidding behavior, I worry that you could get kind of strange results when in the end, the overall economics are, driven by differences in marginal cost between the different areas.
And so, Doug, this is, and what I'm trying to facilitate here is a discussion on what is the principal way of allocating it under all conditions. And so, under this condition, if we go along or go on with the original viewpoint of that it should go all to the balancing authority area that's from EDAM, then you would have all those costs going to BAA and BAC, and none of it would go into BAB. And so, yes, we're trying to have this discussion is which of these scenarios is the most appropriate way to allocate transfer revenues and ITC congestion when the transfer is facilitated by the EDAM BAA to get the boundary of the ISO balancing authority area, and then the ISO's transmission, which is all turned over, takes over, and now we have an additional constraint. The ITC is binding.
Yeah, I understand that. I guess my point is that in this scenario, there would be an incentive, for parties who were in BAB, if we were under the scenario 2C regime, to bid in a way to make it bind. And whereas if we were in under 2A, they wouldn't have that incentive, and I just worry that, this is just one scenario, right? One example, but it just seems like we could be setting ourselves up. I mean, because either way, right? This transfer has value because there's a difference in the marginal cost of the resources in the different BAAs, and that's true independent from whether people are bidding their resources or bidding at the intertie. But yet, if we were 2A versus 2B or versus 2C, we have a different outcome.
So I want to pull on the thread a little bit about the non-EDAM BAA having incentive. And so if I don't have any EDAM BAs associated with an intertie, and I only have a non-EDAM BAA, I'm trying to understand the incentive to get the ITC to bind, because all of that congestion would remain into the ISO balancing authority area. So I'm trying to understand why adding in the EDAM BAAs, which they're not bidding, they're being optimized based at the resources, would incentivize potential non-EDAM BA intertie bidding to try and force binding.
Because if, in the example you have here, if you, I don't want to say, if it's not binding, maybe I'm misinterpreting your example. You're saying it's not binding in this example. I guess my point is maybe we need to flip to what happens when it binds.
And that's example 5. And this is where Jeff Spires was pointing out that the extra $150 is could be distributed to CRR holders, which would reduce that shortfall. So in this case, if we're setting it up that if the ETSR is binding, my 500 megawatts associated with the non-EDAM BAA coming into the ITC, which is what drove the binding, all of that congestion associated with that, because now we are having the full 700 megawatts is going to have apply an ITC constraint to have the energy flow within balancing authority area B. That is congestion rents within BAB. 2A says that 200 megawatts needs to be shared with with EDAM BAAs. 2B and 2C says no, it shouldn't be shared. It should remain within that balancing authority area. So I was trying to demonstrate what happens when only the ITC is binding.
Right.
Just clarification that you're saying only there can only be ITC bids from the non-EDAM BAA. So the implicit is the EDAM BAAs, there's no intertie bidding.
Correct.
For that capacity. But
yes.
But I mean, you could submit a bid.
The EDAM BAA among each other are all going to have transfers back and forth. They're not going to be bidding per se like they do today. The only bidding would come from the non-EDAM BAA to an EDAM BAA.
But the bucket 2 transmission, let's say, that's in the EDAM BAA, there's no bidding at the interties for that, right?
Between the EDAM BAAs, no, there is no bidding at those interties. Correct.
And between the EDAM and the BAAB, between EDAM and TISA?
Correct.
So, but yet so if there's no non-EDAM BAA, it sounds like it's a non-issue. But if there's still remains non-EDAM BAAs, so there are intertie bids, then it seems like you could be flipping the result. But can I go back one step? If let's say there is no non-EDAM BAAs, how does the intertie bind? There's no intertie bids from anybody.
But the limit at that intertie location still binds. So
and it's binding based on the transfers that are filling it up?
Correct.
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, that goes back to example 2. And that's why I tried to look at this quickly, but maybe I should have spent a little more time. In example 2, I only have EDAM BAAs. I don't have a non-EDAM BAA. We are at the ETSR limits for both of the EDAM BAAs, but that also pushes us at the ITC limit as well. And so under this scenario, the same 3A, 3B, 3C is just like the other situation where do you share the transfer revenue in the ITC, or do you share the TSR and not the ITC, or don't share either? And so this is an example of what would happen if you just had EDAM BAs associated with BAB or the ISO. I didn't put any reference to CRRs in here. That's all.
Yeah, this is helpful. I just also keep in mind that there's the CRRs are settled based on MCC differences. The ETSRs aren't. They're settled based on the overall LMP differences. So implicit in these examples were sort of assumed away losses, and I think that's a factor we need to think about.
Yeah, and that's what we're kind of doing with the 3C separates the MCC differences within BAB because you are actually explicitly identifying the congestion costs associated at that scheduling point in order to facilitate the CRR. Whereas the transfer revenue is going to be the difference between the LMPs between the EDAM BAs and BAB. So now if we do a situation like we're saying 3C, what we would do is identify the marginal congestion cost at that boundary point of BAB, and that would be stripped out and allocated through CRRs. And now the differences between the LMP at those two locations minus the ITC shadow price would be what the transfer revenue would be. I know it's confusing, but
no, I understand. Get it.
It's confusing when I said it, so that's why I said that.
Lots to think about. Doug, why don't we go on? We've got other people in the queue.
Sure.
Could you please, operator, could you please open the line for Tong Wu?
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Tong Wu from WAPA. These examples are very helpful. At least these examples bring up some interesting discussions. I wonder how these examples would work when there are more BAs. Basically, it's not like a two BA, two bus system, two node system. When you have a looped system, the shadow price and the LMP differences are not the same at all. The LMP differences are related to the shadow price by the shift factors or power transfer distribution factors. For this example, at a conceptual level, it's fine, but I think those are important aspect if you talk about revenue sufficiency. Because the price difference, even for the two BA system, the price difference equals the summation of all the shadow prices. If you have a series connection or you have some constraints that are in series, not in parallel, so it would be addition of these shift factor. Shift factor would be 1, so it would be simply the summation of the shadow prices. If you have a parallel constraints that are binding at the same time, then you get into a numerical instability. You have degenerated optimization cases where these shadow prices may be undetermined. So I know these are the details, but I think these some things that I'm not quite clear how the relationship between the shadow prices and the LMP differences are dealt with. Because here in this specific example, you have shadow price for the ITC, and you have price differences for the other transmission congestions or congestion transmission constraints. So this is a kind of a two-area system. It's kind of a simple system, but if you have a loop system, the situation could be different. I don't know how different it would be, but I think it probably would be different.
And you're right. As more the balancing authority areas make a decision whether or not they're going to join EDAM versus stay EIM or non-EDAM, it does complicate things. But I tried to demonstrate a little bit here, Tom, in example 2, where BAA is binding, but BAC is not. So I do have a price differential between the two EDAM BAAs, but I also have it because the two BAs are sending enough energy to make the ITC bind within BAB. I now address the fact that the ITC is bound within BAB. And so if you look, the congestion costs are, it depends on how you want to share it. Now, in this case, we're sharing the congestion costs between BAA, BAB, and BAC based on the transfer capability, but when it comes to transfer revenue, I only am trying to share the transfer revenue between BAA and BAB because I don't have any transfer revenue with BAC. And so when we get to a situation where it's not shared, then BAA would get all of the transfer revenue, and then BAB would get all the intertie constraint.
George, did you want to get on this discussion? George Angelides, operator. Thank you.
Thank you. This is George Angelides with the ISO. I just want to clarify the previous discussion that took place relating saddle prices with LMPs. And Tony is correct when we're talking about physical flows. If there's a physical congestion where that constrains physical flow, the difference of the LMPs across that congested path is not always exactly equal to the saddle price of the constraint. It really depends on how the shift factors illustrate the portion of the flow that flows on that constraint, because there are parallel paths. But here we're not dealing with physical flows, we're dealing with schedules. So transfers are schedules, they're not physical flows. So this is a scheduling limit, the ETSR limit. And shift factors don't play a role. It's like you can assume that the shift factor is 1. And the same goes for the intertie schedules. So with a non-EDAM BAA, these are also schedules, they're not physical flows. So that's also a scheduling limit, and the ITC is also a scheduling. So all of these are schedule limits, not physical flow limits. So in this case, if you have a price differential across that scheduling limit, that is really the saddle price of the constraint. So in this example here that we have those 3 BAAs, if the transfers from A to B are binding and the transfers from C to B are not binding, then there's a price separation between BAA A and the BAA C and B. And that price separation is the saddle price on that binding ETSR1 between A and B. So it's I just wanted to clarify that, make sure that we're not considering shift factors in these determinations. They don't matter. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Okay, George, thank you very much. That clarifies part of the question. Now, if, say, in bucket 3, an entity provides some transmission there, and do you designate certain schedules that can use it and other schedules cannot use it if it's not a flow-based constraint? How do you designate who is going to use in which transmission?
That's an excellent question, Tom. So the answer is really depends what is the use of that bucket 3 transmission for. So let's say that is not associated with a transmission contract. It's simply transmission that is released under bucket 3 for use in EDAM, then it will be optimized based on its hurdle rate, whatever usage fees is assigned by the transmission customer or the transmission owner. And it will be used if the prices, if the LMPs across that interface are higher than the hurdle rate, than the usage fee. So it will be used economically. There is no specific party or scheduling coordinator that gets to use it. It will be scheduled just economically. The other scenario is if this is associated with the transmission contract. That's in my view, I think that should go under bucket 1. But let's theorize here. If it's bucket 3 and associated with a contract that is exercised by the owner of the contract, then that makes sense for that scheduling coordinator who exercises its physical and financial right to self-schedule the ETSRs, which are the resources, the pair of resources that define the transfer, so that essentially you can deem that this contract holder is actually using its own transmission that is released under bucket 3 in this case. But again, this construct to me doesn't make much sense. Why would you put a usage fee on transmission that you release in EDAM if you intend to use it. You would do it under bucket 1. That makes more sense to me because then you need to, this will actually allow the user of the bucket 1 transmission in the resource efficiency evaluation, which makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't you do that? So you have these two scenarios. One is the realistic scenario that I believe it can play out, where you release transmission under bucket 3 with the usage fee, and it's optimized by the market. No specific part is using it. And the transmission customer that releases that receives the transfer revenue for its use.
Yeah, George, I agree with you. For bucket 3, most likely it's not going to be related to the schedule. It's not like tied to a specific schedule. Anybody can use it. In that situation, would the shifter factor play a role in this? Because it's not a schedule limit anymore. It's a transmission in the system that is used by the power flow. Whoever schedules, doesn't matter, is the power flow. Would the shifter factor become part of this then?
No, it's still a schedule, right? It's still a transfer, which is a schedule, and it will have a scheduling limit. But in this case, you can collect transfer revenue even before the scheduling limit is hit, just for using it. If there is any schedule on it, and I'm very careful saying schedule and not flow, because these constructs are for schedules between BAAs, so they're not physical flow. So no, the shift factor does not have any bearing on this.
I see. So when you have a bucket 3 transmission, there is no physical constraint. It's all scheduling constraint. It could be a fictitious schedules.
I wouldn't call them fictitious. They really represent scheduled energy that goes from one BAA to another. It's just tagged on that specific intertie. Now, the physical flow could have different parallel paths, so that doesn't mean that there is an equal amount of megawatts physical flow that will be transferred on that particular intertie, but that megawatts will flow from one BAA to another, but maybe through parallel paths. So this particular construct is only a schedule, and it has its scheduling limit. It does have a representation of actual megawatts flowing between BAAs, but not on this specific intertie per se. That's
right,
the difference.
Right. You know, I use the word fictitious. Maybe it's just say it's just an artifact of the modeling. It's not, you know, physical. It does not match. That schedule does not match the flow on the, the interface. So do you have any? Would you have any physical limits on that bucket 3 transmission at all, or that's not modeled at all? Physical limit, flow-based limit is not modeled at all. It's simply the schedule.
We do have physical limits, not your regular physical transmission constraints.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's unlikely to see those imposed on interties because in reality, the scheduling limits, which what we're talking here, are more restrictive than the physical transmission limits. For example, your actual transmission lines could transfer more energy. However, because of simultaneous power transfer capability limitations, the schedule limits are usually more restrictive. So it's unlikely to see both physical and scheduling limits on interties. That's why we're only talking about schedule limits on interties. The physical limits are inside on internal transmission.
Okay, so it's not modeled at the EDAM BA to BA interface. There's no physical limit, although it's not likely, but you never know. Depending on situation.
It depends.
So it's not modeled, or you model that. You make sure that they don't bind, or you don't model them at all.
I do not believe we have transmission corridor constraints, but I haven't seen those on interties. Usually you have scheduling limits on it that are more restrictive.
I see. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, George. I still have to think about it, how this would work, but yeah, understand what you're saying. Thanks.
In essence, what James has laid out here is for each one of his examples, he's got scenario A, which you share the ETSRs and the ITC, scenario B, where you share the ETSRs but not the ITC, and scenario C, where you don't share the ETC or the ITC or the ETSR, which is where the principals ended up in their paper landing. So we've got Kelly Wells in the queue.
Yes.
Kelly?
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. I just wanted to connect something James said earlier with the conversation that just took place regarding the bucket 3 transmission, just to make sure I have it right in my mind and I'm understanding it correctly. So first, I guess James mentioned earlier when we were talking about the non-EDAM BAAs and the EDAM BAAs, the idea that if you are an EDAM entity, you cannot submit import bids on the interties. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, but you can put, if there's bucket 3 transmission, you can have a hurdle rate on that transmission so that if the optimization uses that hurdle rate or uses that transmission, the price differential already reflects the fact that we've exceeded that hurdle rate, and we will have a distribution of that hurdle rate to the transmission customer from the transfer revenue, and then the balance of the transfer revenue would be distributed or split 50-50. So it's similar to my example 1. I didn't put a hurdle rate in these examples. I probably can do one if we want, but it doesn't preclude you from putting a hurdle rate on bucket 3.
Okay, so that's helpful. So then I guess my follow-up question would be then, so if bucket 3 transmission is made available, then does that mean you can the only people that can have access to that bucket 3 transmission are EDAM entities? If non-EDAM entities are can only bid on the interties?
Yes, because the transfer is to get to that balancing authority area, and so non-EDAM balancing authority areas will be having the same intertie location, but I'm not using transmission from the EDAM BAA to get into that balancing authority area.
Yeah, George, do you want to jump in on this discussion?
Yeah, George, please help.
Yeah, just to make sure that we're all on the same page on this. So, Kelly, what we're saying is that on an intertie between two BAAs in the EDAM market footprint, there are no bids because the bids at the resources in each of these BAAs, they contribute to the economics that schedule the transfer. So a bid at the transfer, and I'm not referring to transmission bids like the hurdle rate on bucket 3, an energy bid, would not make any sense because where is that tied to? The energy is already calculated based on what clears the market in the two BAAs, and the difference of supply and demand is flowing as a transfer. And the transfer represents the economics of all the bids behind it. So there's no concept of an intertie bid on an intertie between two EDAM BAAs. You already have those bids at the resource level. On your question on who gets to use that transfer, is really not any specific customer that uses that. You know, again, I'm going to go to the previous conversation and say, the exception for exercising transmission contracts under bucket 1, where the contract owner will potentially self-schedule the ATSR. That's the exception. But in general, the transfer is used by essentially everybody in the market footprint. Any resource could have a contribution, but it's not specific. We cannot tie the transfer to any specific resource. It comes out from all the resource contribution. And even if you have some intertie schedule at the non-EDAM boundary, something that we need to discuss here at some point, even that energy could potentially be deemed flowing on some transfer within the market footprint. So there's no specific association of the transfer with any specific resource or bid. I just wanted to make sure that this is clear.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, and I understood that. I'm just trying to figure out this bucket 3 transmission, how do intertie bids or can non-EDAM participants also have the ability to utilize the bucket 3 transmission that's made available? But I appreciate your response. I'll take it back and think about it more.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that it doesn't matter what kind of bucket of transmission it is, again, with the exception of bucket 1 associated with specific transmission contracts. All other transfers, they're used by potentially anybody who clears the market. The specific association, or what difference does it make, bucket 1, 2, 3, it's all optimized, right? It's just that bucket 1 and bucket 2 are taking priority scheduling because bucket 3 has a cost for using it. And that cost, again, is like a transmission bid. Don't confuse it with energy bids at the resource level or potential at an intertie.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'll think through that one a little bit more.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelly. Jeff Spires, you have another question?
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Jeff Spires with PowerX. James, can you go back to example 6 for a moment? Thanks. That's great. I just wanted to follow up on some of Doug's comments earlier, because I think he was raising some important points. And I think it's worth just taking a step back from the details of the examples and just discussing some of these at a higher level again. So in this example, I think the one thing, as Doug was pointing out, and I would just reemphasize, there is $6 of value in these EDAM transfers. Regardless of how you end up allocating that's the starting assumption. We have $6 of value associated with the EDAM transfers coming in to the CAISO BA. And those transfers are supported by transmission that's being made available on the external systems to get to the CAISO border, as well as the transmission within the CAISO itself that's being made available to receive that. And so the question really comes down to, how do we allocate in a fair way that $6 of value for the EDAM transfers? And when I look at scenario 2C that we've been talking about, what you see is in this particular example, the outcome is that 2/3 of the value goes to the external systems and 1/3 goes to the CAISO. And that's because the calculation is based on whichever, what the calculated congestion is on the external system versus the internal system, and essentially which side gets calculated to have congestion first. In this example, it's 2/3 EDAM, 1/3 CAISO. But it could very easily be something completely different from that. The following hour, it could be that 100% of the value goes to the EDAM entity and no value goes to the CAISO BA. The hour after that, it could flip, and it could be that there's no value going to the EDAM entity and there's 100% of the value going to the CAISO. And the point being that it is not predictable at all what the outcome is, and it's not following any particular principle about what we would think is a fair and appropriate outcome. It is entirely determined by the algorithm in terms of dictating which side is identified as having congested first. And one of the significant issues that we see with this is not only is it unpredictable, but it also has a significant risk of resulting in a systematic and disproportionate outcome where one side or the other ends up not getting fair value over time. And I don't think anyone would be happy if they end up being on the side of the intertie that isn't getting full value because the algorithm is calculating that the congestion should get allocated to the other side for whatever reason. And I think what Doug raised in addition to that is also legitimate, that that kind of approach will lead to undesirable incentives, because the only way it really results in essentially whichever side has less transmission receives 100% of the value, despite the fact that there is transmission required on both sides to enable that transfer. And so I just wanted to raise that that is quite a bit different from scenario 2A, where the approach is you take a step back and you say there's $6 of value. We have transmission owners on both sides of this intertie. We will split that value equitably and share it, and it doesn't matter which side is calculated as having congested first, because the principle is that this transmission is necessary to support the transmission. There are multiple rights holders, and we want to have a robust and durable approach to allocate that in a predictable and fair way. And so I just wanted to raise that because I know that these examples are important and they are complex, but I think we're lacking somewhat in a higher level discussion around what we would like to see as an equitable outcome.
George, did you want to respond to that?
Thank you, David. This is George Angelis from the ISO. So yes, Jeff, these examples here, they show different potential outcomes, and you know, we want to keep the discussion open. But I really want to challenge something that you mentioned regarding the value that the ETSRs create here on this example, where you have both a transfer scheduling limit binding and the ITC scheduling limit binding. In your view on what you said was that the ETSR creates a value of $6, which is the $4 scheduling limit shadow price on the transfer, plus $2 the scheduling, the shadow price on the ITC, which is also binding. And I want to challenge that because, in my view, I see the transfer as a connection between these two BAAs, A and B, B being the ISO in this discussion. However, the ITC limit, the way that we set it up for the ISO is a lot more than an intertie scheduling limit. It reflects power transfer capability, simultaneous power transfer capability limits, nomograms for North California Hydro. It reflects internal constraints within the ISO grid. In my view, this is a constraint for entering into the ISO grid. It's not part of the transfer between BAAs that terminate at the boundary of the ISO. To get inside the ISO, you have to navigate through this ITC limit. In my view, this ITC constraint is really an internal ISO constraint. The ETSR does not create value for the $2 of that ITC. It's not part of the transfer. We had this discussion before, years ago, and with this statement, I'm just remembering all these elements of this conversation, and I felt obligated to state that. Thank you.
Thanks, George. I appreciate your response. I think when I just back up and look at this, you have $25 energy in an EDAM BA that can displace a $31 resource in the CAISO if there is the capability to support a transfer between those BAs. And in these examples, those transfers are across coordinated interties like the AC, like the DC, that have multiple segments and rights holders on both sides, and they are all necessary to support accessing that transfer and enabling that $6 of value to be achieved through the dispatch and through an economic transfer of energy from the lower cost region to the higher cost region. And so I think when we are talking about how to allocate that value, there should be a principle that it should be returned to the entities that are funding the lines that support that. And that includes on the upstream segment and the downstream segment.
And Jeff, you do agree that this $2 value for the ITC is there if there are not transfers, right? You could have only imports like today from non-EDAM BAAs, and this $2 saddle price has nothing to do with anything with transfers because the transfers are not even there today. So in my view, this really puts it on a different level from the transfer saddle price. I mean, that's, how do you navigate that part?
Well, I think what I said earlier on was I agree with you that the congestion associated with a non-EDAM transfer is not what we are referring to. We were talking about the economic value of EDAM transfers between BAs. And so this is specific to in this example, you have the two EDAM BAs that are supporting 300 megawatts of EDAM transfers. And there's $6 of total value between those two BAs. Just like in any other instance, put the CAISO aside, there's two EDAM BAs that are transferring between one another. And I think the assumption is that that economic value would be shared between them, recognizing that they're both contributing transmission to enable that transfer. And so I'm drawing a very similar principle here, but I agree with you that it's not applicable to the non-EDAM quantity going into the CAISO BA. I'm not suggesting that.
Okay, let me challenge this a little bit, Jeff, because as you know, we do release CRRs as a congestion revenue instrument for hedging schedules in the day-ahead market. And now these schedules could cross BAAs. You could have a source in one BAA, let's say BAA A in this example, and a sink in BAA B. And as a result of the day-ahead schedule settlement at the prices at the LMPs for A and B, you have a cost for congestion that is represented in the LMPs at the location of the source in A and at the location of the sink in B. We do provide congestion revenue heads for the portion of that schedule that is within the ISO. So from the border, from the intertie to the location of the sink in BAA-B. And the schedule all the way from A through B, now it could cross, you could have a participant that is using the transfer to get to its sink, or you could have a participant in a non-EDAM BAA that also goes through the intertie and delivers energy at its sink at B. And they both could be CRR holders for the portion of that schedule from the intertie to the sink location at B. If you take now some of the revenue from the ITC, which actually factors into the congestion cost for these participants, for the participant in the non-EDAM BAA, if you don't take that revenue and you leave it with the ISO can use it to fund that CRR. But for the other participant in BAA-A, if you take that revenue from the ITC from the ISO will not be able to fund that CRR for that participant, which has already been released, and that participant is already a CRR holder. So I see some very big potential problems if we start getting revenue from the ITCs and start sharing them across BAAs. This concept is only valid for the transfer because we excluded the transfers from potential CRR release. So even if BAA releases CRRs, those CRRs go from the source in BAA to the boundary of BAA. Then we have transfer revenue on the transfer, which goes to the transmission customer. That's not part of the CRR holder. The CRR holder could be the transmission customer, but generally not. So there is no hedge for that piece, but there is a hedge from source in A to the border of A and border of B to the sink in B. And that should include the ITC because the ITC imposes a congestion cost essentially in all that transaction. Do you see this?
I feel like the argument that you're making comes across like I am suggesting that the CAISO should give up revenue. And that is not what I am saying. What I am saying is that the two elements of the congestion should be split equally. As in this very example, under 2A, the value is split equally, and the CAISO allocation that results from that is a higher dollar value. So then the CAISO has more dollars to allocate back to CRR holders how it sees fit. It's better off in aggregate and can sort through the mechanics of how to redistribute those fairly. But the bottom line is we're talking about sharing the value on both sides. We're not suggesting, for example, to take congestion value away from the CAISO and give it to the upstream segment. It's about an equal split to try to avoid some of the issues that I raised before about the unpredictable and what we see as significant risk of systematic outcomes that are unfavorable to one side or the other. And, you know, I just think of a very simple example. You have the Pacific DC. If you had a transfer going from the BPA Balancing Authority area to CAISO from Big Eddy to Sylmar, and you have rights holders on the northern segment from Big Eddy to Knob, and you have rights holders on the southern segment from Knob to Sylmar, all on a single line, would it be appropriate to have a calculation that provides 100% of that value or some disproportionate share to one side or the other? It's a single line in that example, so it keeps it pretty straightforward. You have one line, one flow, you have economic value associated with that EDAM transfer. Why would we not agree that the best allocation is to distribute that back to the entities that are funding the line in a way that is equitable? That's what I don't understand.
Okay, Jeff, we've got a lot of people in the queue, so let me go ahead and move on to other people. Kelly Wells, you had a comment?
It looks like it was from the previous session. From the previous question that she asked.
Okay. So we've heard, in essence, from Jeff and PowerX that they're more supportive of scenario 2A, where the ETSR and the ITC is shared. The principal document comes out with scenario C, where there's no sharing of ITC or ETSR, which also aids in ensuring that there are no shortfalls or issues for CAISO, their CRR rights, which is what George was just talking about. So can I hear from some others what their thoughts are as far as, you know, sharing it or just sharing the ETSR or going with the no sharing option? Emmanuel Sanchez?
Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
I thought one of the constraints that you were trying to maintain was that you wouldn't have to change your rates or your ode or whatever because of the CRRs. Is that what if you were to do scenario 2B or C, is that what you're suggesting, that you would be having to do that? Because it seems like an obligation that you guys have internally to the Cal ISO to maintain the CR obligation, and that's why you don't really favor a 2B or 2C. Is that correct, though?
No, the principles are ended up on 2C, which is no sharing, which results in the ability to fund the CRRs. 2B would do the same thing, but then they're sharing the ETSR. And the question is for the other EDAM entities, if they're sharing the ETSR, is that fair from their perspective? And the outcome of the principal discussion was to go with C, which... So,
I guess maybe I have it backwards then. If we did something like 2A, it sounded like you're not being able to meet an obligation for the CRRs within the Cal ISO. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you would have to have some type of regulatory adjustment, and that would to make that possible. Is that correct?
So what would have to happen, Mrs. James, is the determination would have to be for 2A is the transfer revenue, whether or not that belongs to be allocated to the participating transmission owners that provided that transmission, or instead it should be allocated to CRRs. The way I set up the scenario, since they're not one and the same, I allocated the transfer revenue to the participating transmission owners, and then for the ITC, I allocated that to what would be the CRRs. So that's why I indicate that there would be a shortfall, because you're taking the internal or the intertie constraint that would be providing congestion revenue for CRRs and sharing that, and the transfer revenue would be going to the participating transmission owners who have entitlement on those intertie locations.
Okay, so is there a concern that they could potentially come back and say, hey, you're leaning on us to make this work? The internal.
That, I think, could be part of the discussions that could be made.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So let's go back to 2C. What are the thoughts on at least starting EDAM with the 2C allocation? Anyone? Kevin, Kathy, Jeff, Scott, Stuart?
As a reminder, you may enter the queue by using the WebEx raise hand icon located just above the chat panel. You'll hear a beep tone when your line is unmuted.
Manuel, you had another comment, and could you let us know who you're representing?
Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Okay, I'm sorry. Manuel Sanchez, I'm with Public Service Company in New Mexico, Director of Operations. I just want to ask, well, I think C2 makes sense, especially because you have an obligation. I don't know how you get around not meeting an obligation. So that's just my opinion. But I was also going to ask, on this drawing for P&M to do something where it goes all the way to Cal ISO, and is there any way that you could maybe set up an example where instead of BAA going to BAB, it goes BAA to BAC and then to BAB? Because to me that we're either going to do BAA to BAC, or we're going to try to end up with a BAA, BAC, BAB path at PNM, and I'm imagining we probably aren't the only ones. But is that something that you guys could maybe put together at some point?
I can. It combines example 1 with any of the examples from 2 on, whereas the revenues between, and I'll go back to example 1 real quick. The revenues between these 2 BAAs, because they're both EDAM BAAs, would be shared. And instead of saying BAB, I would change it to say BAC, because they're both providing the transmission to the midway point of the transfer location in order to facilitate the transfer. And then once it gets into BAC, in this case, I'll change, if you want, I can change it there. It then facilitates into here. Now it's into BAC, and it has to transfer into BAB. So I would handle them separately. I would handle the transfer between those 2 separately than I would the transfer revenue going from BAC to BAB. Does that help? I can put an example together if I need to.
Manuel, does that help?
Please unmute your line and proceed.
Sorry. Yeah, I think that would help PNM, at least because I have to explain this to other folks, and there's no direct tie to CalISO, so anything we would be doing would be in an example 1, or like you said, some 3-bubble combination to get to CalISO for an entity like a PNM, where we've got other EIM entities between us and CalISO. So it just because people were going to want to see, well, how's that work for us? So I appreciate it.
Okay. Okay. Well, can I ask you one quick question, Manuel? Do you own the transmission rights to get all the way to California?
We actually have transmission rights across, say, that other bubble. So we would have our bucket 1, and then we would have some point to point that through the other bubble, and then it would be able to get to the CalISO. I believe that would be possible.
Okay. That just provides a little background. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jeff Nelson, you have your hand raised.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, good morning again. It's Jeff Nelson, SE. Yeah, Debbie, what my view and my understanding was something like, and it gets a little confused, scenario 2C, where basically in this scenario where everyone's sort of interfacing with the ISO, I'll just say my simple view is everyone just keeps their own revenue. So my view is that BAA would keep its own ETSR, BAC would keep its own ETSR, and the ISO keeps its ITC. Everyone just keeps their own. Now, when there's transfers between the EDAMs, that was my understanding that they would be sharing the ETSR between the 2 transfers. I think that's just what James said, but it is sort of 2 different examples that we're having to comment on simultaneously. But so when they're doing business with the ISO, everyone keeps their own. When they're doing business between non-ISO, EDAM, BAAs, my understanding was that they would share it. And I just want to be supportive of what the ETSR is really, in my view, not my property to claim. So as long as the people that have the ETSRs are comfortable, we could probably get supportive. But the ITC is my property to claim, in my view.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Jeff. Stuart, you had your hand raised.
Please press on the raise hand icon located just above the chat panel.
Yeah, Stuart Kelly, operator.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Debbie, it was just responding to your request for comment. I don't have comments at this time. I recognize what George says. I do recognize what Jeff and Doug were alluding to as well, and I appreciate the clarification in terms of, you know, if the ITCs are basically ISO customers to claim and ETSRs aren't. So just need to look at the examples in a little bit more detail before forming an opinion. Thank you, Deb.
Okay, thank you. Alba Sabota.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Alba Sabota, PG&E. I just was going to suggest, I mean, to me, there's a certain resonance in what Jeff was saying, Jeff Spires, in the possibility of the revenues being got strategically, because you have on one of the two sides of this constraint, the possibility of one side sort of systematically exploiting its power over that constraint versus the other. And the idea of splitting revenues, of course, is one aim of that is to try to reduce the incentives for strategic behavior. So I think you might want to look at having the DMM or the Market Surveillance Committee look at whether this approach, which certainly makes that you're proposing, which certainly makes a lot of sense, is it more susceptible to strategic behavior because of the way that the rights are being split?
Okay, thanks, Alba. All right, we've just about run out of time. Does anybody have any last-minute comments? Okay, for starting next week, we are going back to the two Tuesdays and Thursday cadence, 9 to 11. So looking forward to speaking to everyone. And we will start with the examples that we put together as far as flow of megawatts across EDAM and non-EDAM BAAs, so that you can see the megawatt side of that discussion. And with that, if no one has any other comments or questions, I'm pausing a few minutes. All right, well, thank you everyone for participating today. Greatly appreciate the discussion and the help in moving forward. The last slide in the presentation lists all the different EDAM resources we have available. Please let us know if there are anything else that we can do for you. And with that, operator, we can conclude the meeting.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.